Well, good morning. I did wear red today. Like 2 weeks ago, I was severely chastised for not doing so. Today we're ready to look at chapter 3 of 2 Corinthians. And I've entitled the message, When Your Life Becomes a Letter. I might have substituted the word epistle there. That's the context for which Paul speaks to the Corinthians when he says, you are living letters, you are living epistles, read and known of all men. And the word epistle is a word from epistole, and usually an epistle is something that is written to a conglomerate of people, whereas a letter might tend to be written more toward an individual, such as Paul's letters to Timothy and to Titus. But Paul was the great epistle letter writer. Even the Corinthians acknowledged the fact that he was known more for his writing than he was his preaching, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago. The church of Corinth was a product of Paul's own ministry. He says he didn't build on anyone else's foundation. He came to the city of Corinth in about 50 A.D., evangelized the city. He was there for a year and a half. And we have these two recorded letters that he would write. The first one 5 years later in 55 A.D., and this letter, 2 Corinthians, that he would write a year later in 56 A.D. It's hard to believe that he would have all that time for writing. These were very personable. We've talked about how 2 Corinthians is one of the most autobiographical letters that Paul ever wrote. Romans is the most theological letter, and you may or may not remember, but Romans was written probably between the time of 1 and 2 Corinthians. 4 or 5 years later, he would write the pastoral letters to Timothy and Titus after his imprisonment in Rome, and it would be those 4 years later that he would write the prison epistles from Rome while he was incarcerated to the various churches. The passage here begins with some unusual words that may not make a lot of sense at first, but I'll explain them to you. Let me just read from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. He says, do we begin again to commend ourselves, or defend ourselves, or commit ourselves in some way? The word commend is a word sunistanal, and it means to stand with. So he says, or do we need, as some others, and he's pointing the finger at these would-be false apostles who had come in to confuse the church at Corinth and to criticize Paul. He says, or do we need, as some others, epistles of commendation to you, or letters of commendation from you? And these would-be apostles apparently had some kind of letters of reference from Jerusalem, and they were using those to give themselves credibility for what they were saying to the church and some of what they were saying against Paul, as they were even accusing him of having false credentials. He says, the fact is, you are our epistle, written in our hearts, known and read by all men, and clearly you are an epistle of Christ yourself, ministered by us, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of flesh, that is, of the heart, or to translate it probably a little bit better, tablets of the human heart. And so as you look at Roman numeral number 1 there in your outline, I've just simply referred to verse 1 in this statement, when your life becomes a letter, that you will never need or require a letter of commendation. Paul actually had letters of commendation. I don't know if you remember it or not, but in Acts chapter 15, when Paul was ready to go out on a second missionary journey, he reported to the elders, to the leaders of the church at Jerusalem, all that he had been preaching, because there was questions there as he was preaching to the Gentiles and seeing them saved. That was a whole new thing for Christianity, and they had to have a council just to decide whether Gentiles could be saved without becoming Jews first. And so the Jerusalem church, James and Peter and all of them, John, they wrote a letter of commendation for Paul to take back to those same churches that were in Galatia at that time, and to simply say that what Paul says is true and you can believe his gospel, what it is that he is preaching. Paul would also write letters of commendation. He kind of does in 2 Corinthians as he talks about Timothy, as he talks about Titus, who will come and make a visit in his behalf, and he will commend him, telling the church that they can trust him. The book of Philemon, we preached through many years ago, is kind of a letter of commendation itself from Paul to his master, and it just speaks of all that. So that was very common in the ancient world. In fact, in some of the old writings of papyrus, we have found such political letters, such as one from Julius Demetrius, from Aurelius Archelaus, concerning one soldier by the name of Theon, that when he comes, they are to commend him and trust him and give him a job, if you will. There's another instance in the 5th century that's illustrated from the time of the Council of Chalcedon in 451 A.D., where it was written that there were false teachers and apostles that were trying to confuse them as well. And so they said, any unknown clerics are not allowed to minister in the churches unless they have a letter of commendation from their bishop or from their pastor. So kind of common stuff. We do the same thing today. We write letters of reference, letters of commendation. We send out cover letters when sometimes applying for a job and things of that nature, just to introduce an individual. You've heard me tell my testimony about how I left Council Bluffs when I was a young man and went to Florida. And my family was just worried to death about me because I didn't know a thing about Florida. I just took off and was going down there. And my granddad gave me some advice. He said, what you need to do is go to the Chamber of Commerce in Council Bluffs, here in Council Bluffs, where I was living, and ask them for a letter of reference, I think is the word he used. And then when you get down there to Florida, you can use that letter to let them know that you're not some kind of a scallywag or something. The problem was I looked like a scallywag. And when I walked into the Chamber of Commerce, they looked at me just like that and said, no, I'm sorry, but we don't know you well enough to write any letters of recommendation. Still the scallywag, I know. I suppose the highest letter of recommendation I ever got was an individual who was a pastor at First Baptist Church of Dallas during that time. He was a professor at Southwestern. He was a pastor at Gambrill Street Baptist Church, Travis Avenue Baptist Church. I remember him recommending me years ago, and I was just honored that that happened. Paul didn't need any of that. He had the highest credentials that you could get from rabbinical teaching, as he was taught under the feet of Gamaliel. He had the letters, as I said, in Acts 15 concerning commendation to the churches and so forth. So when this group is saying, you know, he needs letters of commendation, Paul just doesn't even answer it. I mean, he doesn't even give them the dignity of a reply, and he just simply says, you are my letters of commendation, and you are the living epistles that this ancient world and this ancient city needed, and that's pretty profound. Letters like that are important. They sometimes have a difference on whether or not you got a job or not, concerning your references, concerning your credentials, concerning proof that you have a degree or whatnot. I remember I was living in Fort Worth years ago when I was going to seminary, and I had had a role in leading a young man who was an engineer working with Carswell Air Force Base in conjunction with General Dynamics and building the F-16. I was influential in him becoming a Christian, and I discipled him for, 8 or 10 weeks. In that discipleship process, he shared with me how disappointed he had been in himself because prior to becoming a Christian, he had falsified those letters of commendation and his credentials. He did not have a degree in engineering, in other words. He had falsified his resume, and he was saying, I believe God is telling me I need to be honest about that and tell them what I've done. And so we prayed that they would be merciful, and amazingly enough, they let him keep his job, and he continued to work to get that degree. And I think it meant a lot that he had the integrity to own up to that, and he made that part of his testimony to them as he shared why he was telling them that he had become a Christian. So when your life becomes this living letter, this living epistle of God, and your testimony so shines before men that they see your good works, you really don't require the letters of commendation like these false apostles were demanding. Notice Roman numeral number 2 in verse 2. When your life becomes this living letter of Christ, others, kind of quoting a hymn here, will see Jesus in you. And this is where he says, you are our epistle written in our hearts, known and read by all men. You've probably heard the name of B.B. McKinley. He wrote 149 hymns, most of which have been in our Baptist hymnals over the years. He was actually the editor of the Broadman hymnal from years back. He also wrote some other 114 lyrics to songs that other people used. He was a professor of church music at Southwestern Seminary for 22 years. He actually pastored Travis Avenue Baptist Church. He has encampments named after him. And his mother had always taught one thing, and he continued that teaching into his own ministry by telling people that when they sang, to be sure and mean the words that they were singing. And so one of those songs that he wrote, along with Speak to My Heart and Breathe on Me and Have Faith in God and The Nail-Scarred Hand and so many more, was Let Others See Jesus in You. And so when we sing that and we talk about it, it's one thing to say it, and it's another thing to really let that happen as God has called us to do. Yes, we are living epistles. Pastor Robert G. Lee, who was pastor at Bellevue Baptist Church for 33 years, would often preach from this passage, talking about how we're living epistles read and known of all men. And he would just urge us to understand that when we're talking about evangelism, we cannot assume anything in the people we're preaching to, because the world out there doesn't go to church. We're here at church, but they're not here. The world out there doesn't read the Bible. So he would say, the only church that the world goes to is going to be you and I. The only Bible the world is ever going to read is going to be you and I. And so how we live, what we say, is going to influence them. It's going to show them. We'll become living epistles as to what Christianity really means. When we talk about Christianity, you know, most of you have been Christians long enough, that the word Christian was a mock kind of word that was attached to the early disciples as they were first known as the Way in Acts chapter 9 and Acts chapter 22. But the idea of a Christian was like a duplicate, like a carbon copy of Jesus. In fact, when they saw the boldness of Peter at Pentecost, they recognized that he had been with Jesus. And therefore, he himself developed that characteristic of being a little Christ, a representative of Christ, another duplicate of Christ who was preaching that same message along with the other apostles. And so this statement here that we're living epistles and it's in our hearts, known and read of all men, means that we can and we must and we are charged to let others see Jesus in our lives. Jesus would enforce those words by talking about that you are the light of the world, and a light is to be set on a hill. It's not to be put under a basket. It's to be put on a lampstand. We are to be very active in letting others see Jesus in us. Notice Roman numeral number 3 there in the first part of verse 3. When you decide that you're going to let your life become a living epistle, that you're going to let it be a writing, a piece of God's Word that is actually seen throughout, then you will actually become a letter of Christ, for none other than Christ, by the way. The word of Christ in the original language is referred to as the genitive case. It is a case of possession. It is a case of ownership and authorship. And so the idea is that the day you become a Christian, you sign yourself over title-wise to the possession of the Lord Jesus Christ. In 1 Corinthians, Paul would use those same kinds of words. He says, you are not your own. You have been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and your spirit, which are His. And that was His way there of saying, be those living epistles that can reach out and touch the world. Paul said to the church of Rome in his letter to them that he introduced himself as Paul, a bondservant of Christ, called to be an apostle. So there's no record in Roman literature or history or anything about joint ownerships. The only thing we hear about ownerships and title is that of transfer of title. If you buy something and you sell a house, you sell a car or whatever, you have a title transfer that takes place. And that kind of figurative language is used to describe what happens in our life. When we come to Christ, we sign over title of our very being, our very essence, of our person to Christ. And we no longer are our own. And we are His because we have been bought, just like anything else. We have been bought with a price, and we're to glorify God. I like the fact that it says, clearly you are an epistle of Christ. I think that was saying a lot. We're talking about a very worldly church, as you know from 1 Corinthians, living in a very worldly city. And yet he would use this special word here, phanera. The word's manifest. It means evidence. It means very clearly, he said, as a church, you are this living epistle here, this living letter right here in the midst. That word is also used by John in his epistle in 1 John 3, verses 2 and 3, where he says, Beloved, now we are the children of God, and we know that when He is revealed, when He is seen, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. So even as we raise Him up, it is our duty to be like Him and thus be living epistles, living advertisements. That whole living letter thing, if you Google that, you'll find all kinds of learning courses for children on living letters, learning to read, letters of expression. Letter is a word that is just part of the world. Have you ever heard somebody say, you say something about, they'll talk about somebody and say, oh man, I could write a book, Well, it's talking about the fact that our lives are a book. It may not be written down with pen and ink, as he will use that language here in another verse or so, but it is written on our hearts by the Spirit of God, and that becomes translated to other people's lives and other people's hearts as well. Great musicals have also taken on that kind of language, an apostle of Christ. Look at Roman numeral number 4 in the second part of verse 3, because if you'll dare to allow yourself and to see yourself as a living epistle and become more active in your witness in that regard, Paul says you will become a clay tablet of God. Now this is an interesting contrast that he uses with both ink and the tablet. So let's read it together in verse 3 so you pick up the analogy here that he's using. He says, clearly you are an epistle of Christ ministered by us. And then notice how he says this contrast, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of the living God. That's the first contrast. Now, we think of ink as something permanent. I'm going to write it in permanent ink as opposed to pencil. I think if he was writing today, he would say, this isn't written in pencil, this is in permanent ink. But ink in that day wasn't like ours. It wasn't very permanent. It did fade very easily. It washed very easily. A lot of those ancient manuscripts, you can just see where they faded more and more. We just got a new copier machine in the church office here not too long ago, and we were just having problems with light copies, It was frequently telling us, out of toner, light copies, and we would print something like the bulletin, we'd look at it and we'd say to ourselves, that just doesn't look good, it doesn't look right. And we have one of those little printers at home that it costs more ink than it does to buy the printer, And boy, when it runs out of ink, it's just like that. And it will print out this amazing sheet, and it's like invisible ink because you can't see a thing on it. It'll be copying it, but there's no ink and toner there, so it's just a blank page. So he's saying that you as living epistles are written not with ink that's going to fade or become erased or anything like that, but by the Spirit of God in a much different kind of way. The second contrast actually refers to the writing material. And here in the latter part of verse 3, he says, now, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of the human heart, of the flesh, that is, of the heart, as he reads it. So, that there were many writing materials in the ancient world, and one of the most ancient of those was actually stone tablets. But as time went along, other writing materials was used. Parchment, which is animal skin, was used. And Paul will tell Timothy when he writes, he says, bring to me my cloak and the parchments. And he's talking about the valuable writings. But before parchments, papyrus was used as a writing material. That was in the warp and woof of this material that was grown in the papyrus plant. It was pithed out and placed together. But the problem with papyrus is that it was edible with rodents and insects and so forth. It deteriorated very quickly. We have found copper scrolls, bronze scrolls, many different writing materials. But he uses the word tabla here, that same reference that the Ten Commandments were written on. And one of the most amazing archaeological discoveries of just 45 years ago was the discovery of the Ebla tablets, Because in this area of Tel Mardeth, there was something like 4,700 fragments and 1,800 tablets. It was a library. And a great fire had occurred there, and here these tablets were, and the archaeologists made the point of saying that many of these tablets had never been baked. They were actually still on pieces of rock. But when the fire came and roasted them, it became like a kiln. And it hardened them like it would a beautiful vase and preserved it from all of that time going back to the Bronze Age in ancient Canaan. And so these Ebla tablets, as they're referred to, authenticated much of the history of the Bible, like from a secular point of view, the historicity of Abraham, of Sodom and Gomorrah, of the life of David that during earlier times was sometimes questioned by secular historians. So these tablets that he's referring to, he says, this message of God is not on tablets of stone that can break, can chip, can deteriorate in time, but rather in something much different, in tablets of the human heart. And he is saying that we ourselves can be that message of God's Word, just as strong as the Ten Commandments were originally given to Moses on those tablets that came down from Sinai. If we will just be active in our witness, active in our lives, allowing others to see Jesus in us. And to think that we can be more interested in Sumerian cuneiform tablets archaeologically than we are the great value of what God has given us in His Word that's in our hearts, and the ability we have to share that with others. Would you consider doing that? Would you begin to see yourself as a living epistle that can influence multitudes? If you'll turn to the last point, Roman numeral number 5 in verses 4 through 6, you'll see here how when your life becomes this living letter, that you will become a highly accomplished author. How many of you have ever just some of you have written, and you've given me some of the things you've written, and it's very beautiful, and some of you are published as well. But how many of you have just kind of always wished that you could write something? You'd love to write something if you could. And maybe in the back of our minds we've all thought that, and then we kind of think, oh, I could never do that. Nobody would care what I was writing about. Well, when he says our sufficiency is from God, who also made us sufficient as ministers of this new covenant, he's talking about the epistolary nature of our testimony and what it is that we had to say. So I mentioned B.B. McKinney a moment ago, who wrote 61 great hymns and how many other lyrics. Last week I talked to you about Stephen King and how it was that he had written 200 short stories and 61 novels as he wrote the novel 11/22/63. And we think about, wow, 350 million copies of Stephen King's work have just spread out everywhere, and it's a name that almost anyone would recognize. And yet, I think what Paul's trying to say is that you and I, while we may not be accomplished and authors that are able of writing anything like that, like a bestseller for which that Kennedy thing was 16 weeks on the New York bestsellers list, we can have the same influence or a greater influence as living epistles of our Lord Jesus Christ. And it's all multiplication. It all has to do with a geometric progression. Do you remember in math class when they used to kind of tell you the little illustration of something like, it says, I'll make you a deal. Every day you give me a penny and double it for 30 days. And so you think, well, that wouldn't be so bad. A penny plus a penny is 2 pennies. 2 pennies plus 2 pennies is 4 pennies. 4 pennies plus 4 pennies is 8 pennies. And as you begin to look at that, as it multiplies in a geometric progression, literally, by the end of the 30 days, you are a millionaire, even though you've agreed to go to work for somebody who's only going to start you off as a penny for the first day, 2 pennies for the second day, 4 pennies for the third day, and so forth. And you kind of fool them into it. Well, the reason why the gospel spread, this almost sounds unorthodox, but Jesus confirmed it, wasn't because of everything Jesus said in the first century. He said, greater things than these you will do. The gospel spread because Christians were obedient to what Jesus told them to do, to go to the ends of the earth and preach the gospel. And because of that geometric progression of winning souls that would win souls, that would win souls and win souls, it would become something that the ancients would say they literally turned the world upside down by their message. They did it, which basically means we can do it. we have a small community here. It wouldn't be hard at all to get our minds wrapped around that in an organized way and say, this is our community that God has given us, and this is a people that He has placed before us that we might reach as living epistles. As the worship team comes to lead us, look at the conclusion. It's actually part of the text for next week, but I just kind of give it as a teaser for that time. But verse 7 and 8 basically affirms that when your life becomes a letter, you'll be just glorious. Now that's what the Chiefs are going to be today, just glorious. And that's what we all want today. We want to be just glorious in anything we do. And he says, how will the ministry of the Spirit not be more glorious when we simply do what He asks us to do, to live the Christian life, to live the real, genuine, sure enough Christian life, to be one that is a testimony wherever we go and is an active witness for Him. As we stand together and sing, I'd like to ask you to take the courage to come and confess your faith today, to say that I need to be baptized, that I want to join the church, that I want to do God's will. Let's stand together as we sing. You come.